Well, thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Starfish and the Church podcast. We're delighted that you're here today. Lance, you want to say hi, buddy?
Good day. I started to say good morning, but you're not supposed to timestamp these things. I was going to say good afternoon, so I just say good day.
Oh, we are such pros.
But it's great, obviously, to have Chuck with us. But then we also, the room's lit up because we have Michelle Wegner, who is rapidly becoming smarter and sharper than her younger protege. Well, not younger than her protege, Rob Wegner.
Amen.
No, he's much
That's
older.
for sure.
Much older.
I'm an
He
old
is your
guy.
elder.
So glad you're here today, hon.
Yeah.
So glad. And the theme of this particular podcast, as a part of our new initiative at the Starfish Substack, is the Starfish Soul. And one of the themes that runs through the entire book of Ephesians, which is very central to our work in the Starfish, is this idea of fullness. Ephesians 1 talks about the cosmic fullness that Jesus is filling everything in every way. Ephesians 4 talks about this ecclesiological fullness, the church growing in fullness to maturity. But Ephesians 3 talks about us being filled with the fullness of God. And the greatest opportunity we have in our lives is that we get to become qualitatively more like Jesus, actually transformed. And when it comes to decentralized leadership, job one, the work inside the work, is actually the fullness growing in us. That is the outcome Jesus is looking for. And he will have us become like him. And we have a great friend with us today that has been a mentor to me through his books from afar. And Michelle has had the opportunity through Western. You want to talk about what your experience with Chuck?
Yeah. So I got my master's at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, and I did most of my work remotely, but got to go up a couple times a year. And it was just a phenomenal couple of years. And Chuck was one of my favorite professors, I'll have to say.
Of course.
One of two. So Suzanne McDonald was, and still is,
great.
One of my favorites. Just
Sorry, you're
completely
second place to
revolutionized.
Suzanne, man.
No.
Believe me,
it's
I
very
understand it.
He knows her too. So, but honestly, some of the conversations that we had in different intensives and things were really transformative. As we were exiting sort of our old life, going into our new phase of life. And I feel kind of bad for like vomiting all of my stuff in some of those classes, but it was incredibly helpful to be in such a supportive environment. So thank you, Chuck. In your books and teachings, I still go back to them all the time. So.
We do. And just to be clear, Chuck is a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan. And he also serves as the executive director of the clinical mental health counseling program. He's a licensed therapist, spiritual director, author, retreat leader, speaker, and faculty member with the Soul Care Institute, which Michelle is also a graduate of. And as a therapist, he specializes in navigating issues of abuse and trauma, pastoral and leadership health, and doubt in the dark night of the soul. Hey, we're thrilled to have you here today, Chuck. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, guys. And thanks.
And we're excited about your new book, too, Healing What's Within.
Yeah.
Very excited.
Yeah. When is that going to be released?
October 8th.
Oh, we're so close.
So close. You know what it's like as you get closer to the finish line and you just want to exhale and be on the other side of it. You all know that feeling.
Yes.
Well, let's start out by talking a little bit about why you wrote Healing What's Within. Previously, you've written a book on narcissism in the church, which was profoundly helpful for us.
Incredibly helpful.
So I'm curious, why this as a follow-up to that? Was there any specific personal experience that triggered this journey that produced this book?
Yeah, I ended up writing more about my personal experience in this one than I did in the previous one. I really didn't want to center my own experience of abuse in the church in the previous one, or frankly, other stories. I mean, the publisher, I think at different times had said, hey, why don't you write about, all these big things that are happening? And I wanted to keep that pretty generic and focused on the concepts. But this really came out of, you all know this. I mean, you see folks who are struggling with issues of abuse in the church and struggling really publicly oftentimes on social media. And I think 20 years ago when I experienced being fired from a church, that could have been me. I don't know how many people were on MySpace back then, but I'm kind of glad there wasn't Twitter. But I just had this sense that, in my work, a lot of my work is therapeutic work. There has to be this shift from what happened to you to what's happening within you. And that's the shift from abuse to trauma. Trauma, what lingers within, and so that's what I wanted to write about, is like, how do we do the healing work? Whether it's spiritual abuse, whether you're just coming to grips with the neglect that you experienced in your own life growing, whatever the pain might be, whatever happened to you, how do we deal with what's within?
Yeah, I can't help but think about Michelle and I's journey and some of the hurt we've experienced in the church. And one of the great things that came out of that for me was understanding how profoundly my family of origin was impacting at a certain level at previous to this, like in an unconscious way, the role that I was playing in some of the relationships that I was seeking that ended up keeping me in a place of dangerous vulnerability. And that journey is something we really want to invite all the listeners of this podcast to be open to. If you would ask me when I was like 32 or 33, hey, what was your childhood like? I would have said, oh man, it was amazing.
Great.
It was wonderful. Yeah. And then it took a while for me to experience enough pain to realize there was a lot of crazy dynamics going on. Yeah. And so I appreciate your vulnerability. And it's such a necessary part of becoming an elder presence, is going back so we can go forward. Lance, Michelle, any thoughts on that?
Well, first thing I would say, by the way, Chuck, Rob and I are in the We Have Been Fired by a Church club with you. So we have been, it was, I'd like to frame mine a little different, but really at the end of the day, that's what it was in one of the situations. And it's kind of, as I've thought about that, as you mentioned that in the very early on in your new book, and you intentionally, like you just said, you didn't go into the details of it and everything, but I was thinking about so many of these NFL coaches. It's like, if you're going to be a coach, you're going to get fired. I mean, it's you're going to get hired and you are going to get fired. I mean, it's, and that's not what you expect as a pastor. That's not what they don't tell you that in seminary.
No, because you're the celebrity, you're the hero, you're the, for a while at least.
Yeah, you are the taste of the town, but it very much is like coaches, is when things are going well, they probably getting too much credit. When things are going bad, they're probably getting too much blame, unless it's, a scandal or a fall or something like that. Now, I'm going to deviate from some of the questions that we were going to ask, because I believe that a lot of this, I would like to know, when we're talking about this pain, Chuck, how much of it are you seeing that is self-inflicted? Now, you definitely go into that with the narcissism book. But what would you say about that? what you're seeing right now in ministry in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the way this works sort of psychologically, what I'd say is that, we can be wounded in all sorts of ways, but we also become our own saboteurs. I was just working with someone who experienced narcissistic abuse in a church, and she was saying to me, what I'm coming to discover now is that I've gaslit myself almost worse than I've been gaslit, and so that's why we've got to do this inner work. That's why we've got to sort of turn our attention to, what's the story? What happened to how's this manifesting within me? Because we can get caught up in these cycles, right? Where we end up in some form of self-sabotage, which is ultimately really destructive to us, what I've seen oftentimes for folks in ministry in particular is that it really sabotages their work as well. Yeah. I mean, if part of your ministry, I think, is seeing people become whole so that they become the kinds of leaders that they're meant to be. But I mean, it really does sabotage their work within ministries and organizations if they're not whole.
Absolutely.
I had mentioned about, my personal awakening and beginning to acknowledge the pain that was there and how I was coping with it. I had a very, very close friend, my closest friend besides Michelle, who at one point, you all have seen the movie Wreck-It Ralph. Remember that movie? And there's a character in it called Fix-It Felix who has his golden hammer and runs around and fixes everything. And this brother had really what was a prophetic word for me. And he gave me a golden hammer. And he said, this is your script. You know that, don't you?
He's a good friend. Yeah.
Yeah. Why are you doing this? And I'm curious, like, how do you recommend people beginning that journey or approaching that journey? It can be like that moment in Star Wars where Luke is looking down the tunnel and he knows Darth Vader's down there. It's like, I'm not going down there. Are you kidding me? Like, I know a lot of times it takes a huge amount of pain, right? But once that happens, how do you, what counsel would you give? Even someone listening right now.
I often, the frame of this book is the three questions that God asks in Genesis chapter 3, which I name as where are you, who told you, and where have you taken your hunger and thirst, which is my riff on have you eaten from the tree. And I think where are you is a really beautiful place to begin, because we often begin with what happened to you, and so we get caught in the details, we get caught up in what happened in the past rather than how am I living out this story of disconnection in the present. I think where are you is such a beautiful first question. Of course, Adam and Eve are hiding and they're sowing fig leaves and in the midst of their anxiety and shame. And that's where many of us find ourselves as well. And so part of it is just getting curious about where we find ourselves right here and right now. It's really interesting to me. I'm talking more and more about today that as I'm getting to know people who are leaders in the church in one way or another, I'm talking spiritual directors and nonprofit leaders and pastors and even therapists. There's quite a bit of self-awareness today, like in contrast to when I first got my degree in counseling in the late 1990s, when there was some resistance. But the self-awareness is more about what happened to me and not what's happening within me right now. How am I living this out relationally? What does it look like to be connected to me? How am I going about my day? Am I grounded? Am I regulated? I know I can wake up and within 5 minutes I'm dysregulated. So I'm often saying today there's a difference between self-awareness and self-regulation. And where are you really gets at how we're carrying our anxiety in our bodies. 5 minutes after I'm up, I'm on CNN looking at the results of the vice presidential election. My body's already stirred up, and it's like I'm disconnected at that point. So where are you is such a good first question that evokes curiosity.
So, Chuck,
Michelle, I'm curious.
Go ahead.
Oh, you go ahead. Ask Michelle. No, go ahead, bud.
No, well, I was just going to ask, because in light of that, when you talk about isolation, and that is such a temptation, especially among leaders, because you're supposed to be, the strong gal or guy. You're supposed to be the one that's holding everything up. And if you're falling apart, it's going to fall apart, as far as the way that we look at it. And so there's that fig leaves and aprons that we try to really cover our shame in.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit more about that, because I think it's such the big issue for most of us.
Yeah, it's
First
interesting.
of all, what are you talking about, aprons? I've never heard that phrase before.
That's probably King James, early Genesis, because it does mention aprons. So, but
sorry, that just was like a really funny image in my head.
You can scholarly check me on that, Michelle.
I will. No, I'm sure you are probably 100% accurate.
Michelle, she's almost Dr. Michelle.
No, wait. Dang, I gotta watch it. I gotta watch it over here.
You do.
It caught me as funny. So sorry. Go ahead.
It's interesting to me that here again in that first story, that early story in the Bible, there's a sense of alienation between Adam and Eve and God, between Adam and Eve, and even within themselves. And I think what's interesting to me is, as I've studied trauma, one of the significant contributors to trauma is alienation, is aloneness. Gabor Mate, who's a Vancouver-based physician, addictions expert, trauma expert, he says trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside of you in the absence of a compassionate witness. Which is to say, when we're alone, when we suffer alone, stress is prone to turn to trauma. So, Lance, we were talking a little bit earlier before we started about hurricanes, and my body, certainly your body right now, given what just happened, knows what it feels like to go through a hurricane. And, we've seen it where two people can go through the same natural disaster, hurricane, whatever the case may be. One has support, and in the midst of that support, the stress doesn't turn to trauma. The other one isolates, and it becomes trauma. And so companionship, connection is so important when it comes to how we've been, how we heal from our hurts.
Absolutely. I will attest to that. And I know, Lance, that Sherry had a very similar experience being in the church world as a pastor's wife. It even makes me cringe to say that, but there's still a lot of trauma for me in that. And because of the unique situation Rob and I were in, where it was a wonderful, wonderful church that we were a part of, and so many amazing, wonderful things were happening. And Rob was such a positive presence on stage every week. And, we had our cute little girls and family. And but when things started to go a little south, behind the scenes, and then tension between Rob and I kind of escalated as I wanted to pull back from the whole situation. I found it difficult for anybody even to believe me. And I'm talking my closest friends, people that I considered partners, or, just people we hang out with, because of how everything looked from the outside, it was very difficult for them to reconcile anything with that. And that is where my soul started to crumble, because I was like, I know I'm not crazy. At least I don't think I am. And so I really did go through quite a long period of exactly what you're saying, just going through this trauma alone. And it, Rob, with the very best of intentions, was, trying to hold this huge operation together, and raising 3 highly spirited young women. Our lives were just all over the place, and there just wasn't a whole lot of energy to focus on myself. So
let me ask something in light of that, in what Michelle just brought up there, Chuck, because I think she really does. This just kind of cracks something open huge that doesn't seem to be like it's talked a whole lot, in the last several years, with all the scandals and everything and all the different abuses that are being exposed in churchdom, in leadershipdom. So often the focus is on what happens to the men or the guys or the elder teams or whatever. But the wives are just getting beat up, mentally and devastating. And especially, and I know like Michelle and then my wife, Sherry, which most wives are, they want to protect their husband. And so they're just being torn up from the inside out. But this isn't talked about a whole lot. It needs to be talked about more. Speak to that. What you see.
Yeah. And I'd say it's a particular kind of trauma, first of all, oftentimes, wives, victims, survivors are not acknowledged in the midst of these scandals, right? All the energy, all the press, all the narrative, all the spin is around the leader, and oftentimes spouses and survivors are forgotten. But then there's a unique kind of trauma because my wife experienced us being fired very differently than I did. For me, it felt a little bit more like a public humiliation, but our daughters were in the preschool of the church. They had been baptized in this church. We had been there for 6 years. We had invested really deeply in the community of the church. And, within a 48-hour period, I no longer had an office. Like I was gone. Wow. And so, and I'd done nothing scandalous. I had, in many respects, there was just a senior pastor who didn't see that there was room for me anymore, because there was no room to grow in that church, to step in with any sense of authority. And so that it was devastating for me, but Sarah felt so alone and isolated. People called me, right? But she was forgotten. She was left alone. She's taking care of our girls. But now she's dropping the girls off at the preschool at the church. Right. People are sort of awkward and not. And so her trauma, we're still, it took probably 15 years for her. I tell the story in the book of how I landed in a hospital in 2012. The trauma caught up with me in my body. My system was septic, but it took until about 2019 for Sarah to say, you know what, I'm done. I need to step away from the church for a season. I need to heal in ways that are unique to me, and my journey is not your journey. She would identify as an Enneagram 9. She would say that she's a little bit slower in coming to the reality of these things at times, but it's very different. This is such a great question, Lance.
Chuck, one of the things that I thought was profound, like people that have faced the kind of trauma you're talking about, the kind of trauma that virtually no one escapes by the time they're a grown adult. You talk about the importance of listening to the body signals that it's sending to you.
Yeah.
And we've got, we have this little acrostic that we use as a guide for people when they're creating like a triad space. And it's the word salve. And we talk about shalom first. So it's like, understand someone's shalom story. Like, what are the things that give them joy and build joy together, right?
Yeah.
And then the A is appreciation, which is like, I'm so glad to be with you.
Yeah.
And then the L for us then is listen to your body. So in that 3 to 5 space, it's like, what is your body saying to you?
That's really good.
The V is validation. So it's like, okay, what you're beginning to hear, I'm with you, and I'm not correcting you. I'm with you in this. And then the E is like emotion. Like, what's the emotion that's underneath?
Yeah.
So I want you to talk about, you have a lot of expertise in this, and it's an important part of the book. Like, can you elaborate on why we ignore our bodies and the important role that it plays in actually finding healing?
Yeah, I think many of us learn to ignore our bodies, our intuitions, our gut sensations at a very early age, right? And so, and survivors of abuse that I've worked with over the years will tell me, I was in that church for 10 years, all the while ignoring my body, ignoring my emotions, convincing myself that I was just making these things up. That's generally a very old story in someone. But but it plays out in the present with a real lack of awareness of what's going on underneath the surface. And so I often first talk about what I call the dashboard. Like a dashboard in our car, there are 5 spaces: thoughts, emotions, body, behavior, and relationships. And
Can you hit those one more time?
Yeah. So thoughts, emotions, body, behaviors, and relationships. And when I work with people, I'll often get them to begin. I mean, they can often start with thoughts. That's fairly easy, or behaviors, right? But it's the bodily sensations, it's the emotions, it's how it's playing out relationally that's maybe a little bit tougher for them to see. But I'll ask them to identify, like we would do on a car dashboard, yellow lights or red lights. Is this just kind of a basic warning, or is this an emergency? And it's stunning to people who I work with to see, they'll come in and they'll be like, it's pretty good. It's not as bad as it could be. It's not as bad as Lance's situation, but we'll do this work, and then there'll be like 20 reds, and they're like, I just did not know that it was that bad. And as I often say, that dashboard points to the engine underneath, which is the autonomic nervous system. And it helps us to focus on how their nervous system is sort of chronically adapted in survival mode to their particular situation. And so we get a real sense of how their body has been operating really over the course of years. Sometimes people are in a more sympathetically activated state, which I call storm, which is a lot of go, 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 dogged determination. Sometimes they're in what I call fog, which is a more of a parasympathetic state where they're just kind of shut down, numb, listless, in a stupor, and people find themselves there. People find themselves vacillating between both of those, going, and then shutting down. I talk to pastors all the time who are like, I've been on that hamster wheel for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. So it's pretty stunning when we really check in to see where we are.
When I'm just going to share a little bit about my story. So I had one parent who was stuck in the go, 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 and the other one that was stuck in the paralysis. And I, through spiritual direction, some therapy and inner healing prayer, like I actually can remember the exact moment where I decided I wasn't going to be the paralysis person. And it was like a covenant, a vow that I made to basically like, I'm going to be a force of nature. And I'm going to conquer. And even now I'm a little teary. I feel so bad for that little boy, and it was a coping skill that I guess when I was a little kid, I needed. And that's something I want to say with compassionate people. It's like that.
Definitely.
When you're little, you have to do this to survive. But I just want to invite all the listeners. It's like, you don't need to keep living this way. There is healing in Christ. There is safe community you can find to tell your story, and people who will be with you in it.
Very true.
And I'm curious too. We haven't really talked much about behind the scenes. People also have these corrupt images of God that a lot of times they're unaware of. And you talk about just the profound role that actually the compassion of Jesus plays in the healing journey. And how do people find that? Like, if you have this corrupt image of God, and then you've got, the dysfunction coming in from your family or abuse that's happened, church hurt, and how in the midst of that do people connect with the compassion of Jesus?
It's I don't know if you all have read Jim Wilder's book on his last days, weeks, years with Dallas Willard. I think it's called Renovated, where he talks about, for years Dallas Willard would invite people into practices, spiritual practices, and those were infinitely valuable to people in their spiritual life. But he came to see through understanding our stories and our attachments. This is Dallas Willard, that we need a new experience to change. We need something radically different in terms of our experience of the other, our experience of God, because the reality is that we have a sort of map based on our stories, the way we attach to our parents, for instance, that becomes a guiding map for all of our relationships. And so, my dad was more avoidant. My mom was very anxious. And so for years, my experience was of a very mixed God, sometimes avoidant, a lot of times very anxious. And it took years for me to have a new experience of God. Part of the work of this book, by the way, and those 3 questions from Genesis, was to experience God as curious. In fact, I was studying with a theologian recently who's talking about the attributes of God. And I was like, can I offer one of my own? I don't know if this is, maybe tell me I'm a heretic, but like, I just think God is secure, non-anxious. And I really needed the experience of a God who could move toward me, even in the midst of my own stuff, my own trauma, my own self-sabotage, with a kind, where are you? Not with my mom's anxiety or my dad's avoidance, and so I'm slowly, through a new experience, learning to trust God as secure and curious and compassionate. But that takes a long time. I'd like to think, as someone who preached for a while when I was pastoring, that if I just gave people good concepts, that would convince them that. But that's not often how it works, for as much as those of us who've preached and taught would like to think so. It's often of a new experience with God. And by the way, I teach at a Reformed seminary. It's heresy for me to use the word experience, but it's got to happen through the intellect.
That's
it's got to happen.
But So Chuck, this is exactly my study area.
Oh, good. Tell me more.
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm finding through my research and study and interviews and reading that there are many ways that God speaks, and especially people that are struggling with worry, anxiety, that it takes a jarring event sometimes of beauty or some kind of love, some kind of outrageous outside of normal experience to get life change and reconnection with God, or first connection with God. And I just think that's fascinating that God is that generous with us, that in our unexpected moments that he will give us non-reformed experience.
Well, I love that concept of, Chuck, the way you framed it, as an attribute of God, being non-stressed. I think Mark Sayers' book, and it's been a phrase that's been around a while, but Mark Sayers' newest book, A Non-Anxious Presence. I don't think that can be overvalued enough, that this is the way the Lord is. That's the way Jesus was, anxious for nothing. He wasn't stressed. And I wonder, I've been doing more and more reflection of late, and thinking more and more about the lack of sages in our churches, in the body of Christ, older men and older women, and the fact that we push them so much to the side. And, there is one of the things about the stages of your life. If you are healthy in that later 50s to 60s stage, most older people like that, there is a non-anxious presence. It's kind of like an old seasoned. Here's my NFL analogy again. I keep going to football, but it's like an old seasoned quarterback. That some of these guys are journeymen, and then in their later years, they become fantastic quarterbacks because they've seen everything. There's nothing that can be thrown at them. They're settled in the pocket. There's a non-anxiousness. They're not getting happy feet. I think that we're lacking the non-anxious presence of a lot of our older women and older women being activated in the body. What would you? I know that's a curveball, but what would you say about that?
Yeah, you're right. And I what's interesting is when I was turning 50, so this would have been, I'm 54 now. I was probably 48, 49 when I decided to interview 6 men who were about 70 to say, tell me about 50 to 70. What do I need to know? 5 out of the 6 conversations were really challenging, in part because there was so much anxiety about legacy. There was so much advice. There wasn't a whole lot of curiosity. But there was one where I experienced exactly what you're talking about, Lance. There was a sense of presence. There was a sense of spaciousness. He heard exactly what I was asking and sort of modeled it before me, whereas others were sort of like, well, I'm still trying to figure it out. And I'm still trying to figure out how to retire. And I'm really not sure about my legacy. And
were those preachers, by the way? Were those pastors?
No. In fact, at that point, none of them were in ministry,
Okay.
But I mean, in church ministry, one though had a ministry, and he turned it into, well, maybe this is the answer to prayer. Maybe you should take over my ministry. And I was like,
right, yes.
Here, right?
What a mess.
Yeah.
He's like, can we be codependent?
Yeah.
You're the answer to my prayers.
Yeah. I had a very profound experience sitting out on a Florida beach at 50, a very familiar beach for us that we'd gone to for years and years when we lived there, where I had this sense of, I've been looking for a dad probably my whole life at some level. And I had this sense that God was like, I'm here. Okay. You don't have to keep clamoring after a dad, looking for a dad, that was something I know for me, there was very much a sense of like, I can exhale now. I'm held. I don't have to go chasing after something that I've been looking for the last really 25 years, probably, right? But I like, there's your next book, Lance. Yeah, how do men find their way to that sense of safety and security and non-anxiousness that seems really challenging today, where there's just so much expectation for who we're supposed to be and become.
Yeah, so true. Rob, I know that we're going to have to wrap this up, which means we're going to have to do a part 2 sometime sooner than later if Chuck's going to be up for it. So there's so much more that we would love to dig into.
I say the 3 of us put Dr. Michelle in the chair and we quiz her.
That would be fantastic.
No,
that's going to happen. That's going to happen.
Hey, thanks for joining today's conversation. If you're passionate about flattening leadership structures, equipping everyone to reach their maximum influence, and seeing simple forms of church filling networks of relationships and neighborhoods, hit subscribe. Also, rate this podcast. It really does make a difference. Pick up a copy of The Starfish and the Spirit. You can like the Starfish and the Spirit Facebook page for updates. Finally, join our Starfish U Substack, starfishyou.substack.com. We're building a community of Starfish leaders committed to Jesus-centered change. We want you to be a part of it. You'll get access to exclusive articles, practical tools, more podcasts, training, and great conversations. Thanks again for listening. We'll catch you next time on The Starfish and the Church.